Hey there hunters, and welcome back to the Gunners Guild. Today we're going to take another small break from Baldur's Gate and talk about more Remnant 2. After about 400 plus official hours on Steam of playing, we're going to be discussing and ranking each of the handguns here in Remnant 2 based on their performance in Apocalypse and some personal preference. I also collected some insights from fellow players on the Discords to help out with the rankings, so it's not just entirely biased towards my opinions. So obviously the tier list is going to be one of two, as we're not going to compare the handguns with the long guns because it's not really fair, and melee is just World's Edge, Stonebreaker, and Feral Judgment. But anyway, let's get into this and hopefully make this quick for each of the guns because we kind of have a lot to talk about. Starting in alphabetical order, we're going to discuss the Bolt Driver. It is a fusion rifle for the handgun slot, and what that means is that it's held to charge, then release, then burst. You can improve it with such things that reduce charge time, such as the Supercharged Mutator and the Archer's Crest Ring. The Bolt Driver can actually dish out some monstrous DPS, rivaling and exceeding most handgun slots and even quite a few long gun options. Now, one of the downsides to the Bolt Driver is that if you're going to be using it, you want Archer's Crest, and if you're using Archer's Crest, which means you probably want to use a bow in your primary slot. So the bow is going to want to take the Supercharger Mutator since you can't use two of the same, so it's honestly kind of hard to fit in a build at like maximum performance, but it's not impossible. The Bolt Driver here also has a free mod slot and solid range, and the only significant drawback here is that it has a pretty bad reload speed by default, and without investment on like the charge time, it's pretty bad. It's still a very powerful gun in the right hands though. So the first one that's going to be on our ranking with the majority of the votes, we're going to drop the Bolt Driver here into A tier. And seriously, if you haven't used it much, give it a try. I know it's not meant for every build, but it's still a very solid handgun. Next up on the list is the Cube Gun, an interesting handgun. The Cube Gun provides you with infinite ammo, which can be a godsend on Apocalypse, but can be tricky to use because it's projectile based, not hit scan, and if you miss a cube, it can kind of break your infinite ammo cycle to force you to reload, which is kind of excruciatingly long. The other downside to infinite ammo though is that it has heat buildup, so you also have to be careful with how many cubes you throw, but thankfully the microcompressor ring remedies this a lot. And there are a few other long guns you can pair with the microcompressor to kind of work on both weapons. The mod attached to the Cube Gun is the Cube Shield, which also absorbs range damage only, not melee, and strengthens the cube. And when the cube is fired, it will slowly move and deal damage to anything in its path. The mod is kind of okay. It's kind of tricky to use because it breaks if you take too much damage, and it doesn't block anything at melee range, so you really have to pay attention to how much it absorbs and kind of where you're using it, and then also you have to shoot it at the optimal time. It's cool, but the damage is pretty low, making it just not great for clearing anything but basically trash mobs, which is fine. I mean, overall, it's just an okay weapon, so we're going to drop the Cube Gun here into C tier. It suffers from being non-hit scan and having differing scales between the gun and the mod, making one always suffer for the other, so unfortunately we can't place it higher. And then we have the Double Barrel, the big bag shotgun here in the handgun slot. The Double Barrel is a very meaty gun, packing some of the biggest hits in the game and fully capable of being your primary weapon. The main downsides to this gun are a clip size of 2 and the range, but honestly you can remedy both of these without too much investment. The Extender Mutator brings us to a clip 3, which is more than enough, and the Hunter Trait Longshot provides us with 6 more meters, bringing up to the range up to 11 meters, on par with most other shotguns. But of course we can further extend this by using the Targeting Jewel. And then scaling range and some spread reduction makes this gun an absolute beast. So across the board, the votes were split between A and S tier, but since I have final say, I'm gonna have to give this little guy an S tier. It's easily one of the best handguns, and you can fit it in most builds. Continuing in alphabetical order, we have the Enigma, and while this gun has seen 2 nerfs in the last 3 patches, it still delivers the shock and awe. What makes Enigma so strong is not that it can just target 5 enemies at a time, which already is absurd. It does make quick work of all trash in the game, but also because it scales very well with a variety of different scaling options. Looking back at the Cube Gun, if you're a range damage build, the Cube Gun shot's going to be okay, but the mod's going to be horribly weak, and the reverse is true if you're a mod power build. But with Enigma, you can scale range damage and the primary shot will be excellently strong, and if you scale the mod damage, the ticks from the mod get very strong as well, and they can take down elites in no time. But because the mod triggers off you shooting, either way you scale it, you're going to be dishing out some pretty good damage. Also, both the shot and the mod can scale off of electrical and elemental damage. So yeah, it's just very flexible. It has AoE, it's great at trash clear, and the mod is synergistic. We've had a little bit of discord on this one, again being split between half A and half S tier across the board. And I'm gonna say I'm pretty torn, as it's not as good as it used to be, but it's still probably the best trash clearing gun in the game. So I want to give it an S, also because it's just the best way to deal with Annihilation's orbs. Now following up the Enigma is the other elemental thrower, Hellfire. I have to put it out there, I am not a fan of this gun. The range is pitiful and it doesn't scale with range increasing items or traits, and the damage is bad for being such close range, and also doesn't have good weak spot or crit modifiers, and really the only actual good damage on it is the burn dot. And if you're on Apocalypse, it just kind of takes way too long to flamethrower down enemies at close range unless you're in Geisha. But on lower difficulty, it just kind of melts everything, so I mean I see why normal people like it, but we only really care about its Apocalypse performance. The mod is also kind of weird to me because like Cube Gun, you also can't scale both the mod and the gun effectively. The gun wants fire damage and burning damage, while the mod wants explosive damage and crit, so it's just kind of fighting you either way. Now I want to give this a C tier. It's kind of I'm not a fan, but everyone else seemed to think it a little bit better than me, so I have to put it in B tier based on popular votes, but I gotta say, definitely not for me. Then we have the MP60R, the submachine gun, and I feel like the SMG is very underrated, and I rarely see people use or talk about it, and I honestly can't see why that's the case. The damage is very, very solid for a handgun, its clip size is great, the range is solid, it has 10% base crit chance by default, and the reload isn't bad. Like, it's just good across the board. It's excellent for fishing for crits, and I always pair it with twisted wounds to grab bleeds as well. Seriously, top quality handgun right there. Everyone seems to agree that it's a solid A tier weapon. The only thing that's kind of holding back the SMG is the actual time to kill on some enemies, which can be higher with single shot weapons, as like such a case for all the automatics pretty much. But regardless, the SMG can clear pretty much all the zones and all the elites in the game, and it's even not bad for bossing if you want to swap between two automatic weapons with like Provisioner's Ring or something. It's really, really good. Up next is the Mountaintop, the Meridian. The handheld grenade launcher is quite a fan favorite. It fires little grenades that bounce off surfaces and explode on contact, or can be shot to explode early. And while it's fun and unique, because who doesn't like explosives, right? I don't think Meridian performs up to snuff in higher difficulties. It does have some pretty significant drawbacks that bring it down, including it being a projectile weapon with a weird arc, and a real definite skill curve to be able to use it properly. Having to lead the targets and bank off walls and stuff, like the grenades can be very finicky. It also almost requires you to run kinship trait, because otherwise you could literally just kill yourself with a single shot or misplaced grenade, or an enemy who decides to charge you. The damage also has fall off at range, which is a bit odd for a grenade, so like you can't use it to lob grenades far off into the distance without, dealing minimal damage. Honestly, the best part about Meridian is the mod, which are screamers, and with 5 charges, you get plenty of missiles to dish out to enemies and elites. And the fact that it scales off of explosive damage for both the primary shot and the mod makes the Meridian synergize with itself well enough. Overall, we're kind of split, but it ended up giving it a solid B tier for the Meridian. And now we have the last thrower handgun, Nebula. Like Hellfire, I am not a fan of this gun, but it does have plenty of good things going for it that Hellfire does not. Starting with the negatives though, like Hellfire, it has very poor range, lack of weak spot and crit scaling, and overall pretty low damage output, even lower than Hellfire. It makes the saying absolutely F tier in terms of damage. But silver linings do exist. Nebula is one of the very few ways you can actually get the corrosive dot on enemies in this game, which does provide you with 10% increased damage to enemies who are corroded. This is not a 10% multiplicative modifier, it is just a flat added damage modifier. Not as good, but hey, free damage is free damage, right? The other great feature about Nebula is the mod Nanoswarm. Now, the Swarm of Remnant 1 returns, but it's not completely broken like it was. The damage of Nanite Swarm isn't anything to write home about, and while it does do acid damage, it does not apply corrosion. But again, we still have silver linings. There are plenty of good aspects to Nanite Swarm. First is that it's a fire and forget mod, which will damage stuff for 15 seconds without you needing to swap it or upkeep it or anything. So you can sustain better DPS on your long gun, and just get free damage with an active Nanite Swarm. The Swarm can also crit, which can proc crit things such as Sapphire Dreamstone or Devoured Loop, and that can also hit Weak Spot, which can help proc things like Xania's Malice. So there are a lot of good things going on with Nebula besides just the damage. It's got a lot of little utility. And again, I personally don't like it because nobody really likes Nebula for the actual Nebula gun. They just like it for the debuff and the mod, and then they swap off of it. So they try to use it as little as possible, and to me, that doesn't make a good gun. So again, I would give it a C tier, because I don't really like it, but enough people think that it's got good uses, so it's going to be going into the B tier with Hellfire, which I think is not right. And then we're going to continue on with the old reliable, the repeater pistol. And look, I know no one thinks of this gun as anything special, just because it's like the starting gun in Remnant 1, but I absolutely love this thing. It shoots insanely fast for moderate damage, and all around it's just decent in every aspect. Look, it's not like the best at anything, it's a solid option. The clip size is great, 15 rounds is almost double what the service pistol's got, and the total ammo capacity is great, the reload speed's insanely fast, it's just solid. That being said, it stands out in absolutely no way, and that's obvious. Plus, there's a lot of competitives for the handgun slot, and I don't really have much else to say about it other than it's fine across the board. So we're giving it a solid B tier. Like, it's good, but it's not amazing at anything. Alright, Rune Pistol, a burst fire handgun with an adequate rate of fire and pretty good reload speed. The damage this handgun can dish out is actually pretty good just because of its burst, but it does lack some of the consistency of like the slower rate of fire weapons, which can like 1 or 2 tap things, and it isn't strong enough to compete with something like the Bolt Driver, which is another burst handgun, or something like the SMG, which is just, spray and pray. And while the base gun itself isn't awful, the forced mod on this thing kinda drags the whole gun down. The mod applies a mark to nearby enemies that when killed will heal you for like 20% of your HP when you pick up their little soul fragment. And I don't like this mod because it only marks enemies that are immediately nearby, so you don't get like, a 25 meter aura to like run for with 20 seconds to just continuously mark enemies. Also, it only provides some healing, so 20%, which isn't going to be doing you very many favors in Apocalypse because you pretty much can't get hit more than once or twice. And on Apocalypse, like, you're going to have to heal like 3 or 4 times, so like kill 3 or 4 enemies to heal your life back up. And usually it's just better to heal with like a medic or a relic or something. So like, I don't hate the gun, I just really hate the mod, and there's like nothing else to do with this gun because the burst fire weapon doesn't scale well with any mutators or anything we have. So because I don't really like it, I'm putting this in D tier because I don't think it does anything better than any other handgun, to be honest. Time for Rupture Cannon, the New Age Defiler. Rupture Cannon is another handheld shotgun that fires very fast and can pack quite a punch at a very generous range for a shotgun. Honestly though, it doesn't feel like a shotgun most of the time, it just feels like a heavier repeater pistol. A lot of people did love the Defiler in Remnant 1, but the mod was a mixed bag depending on how your build was scaling. So now we have a modless option that has much more freedom with the open mod slot. And while the gun itself is pretty amazing, the downsides it shares is fairly consistent with all shotguns, and that is that your damage can be very, very inconsistent depending on how many pellets land correctly. And without investing like a ton into spread reduction, it can feel a bit weaker than other handgun options. And there's really not very many great choices for mutators on the shotguns, unfortunately. Like, there's nothing that's going to help its range, spread, or damage in any special way, because typically you want to use Bandit for, smaller clip size weapons. And Extender, I mean, it gives you more rounds, but it's already got a clip of 15, so like, I really don't know what to do with it. Still, the Rupture Cannon is very powerful and has very good damage per second when you're landing things consistently. So, I mean, honestly, it's a pretty easy A tier. Like, you can't go too wrong with it as long as you know what you're getting into. And then we have Service Pistol, Medic's Gold Standard, and this gun is doing pretty much everything right and often feels like a better repeater pistol despite the smaller clip size. It has more damage per shot than the repeater pistol, but less total rounds in the chamber, though it does have a much faster reload time. It doesn't look like it, but trust me, it's really faster. So it often just performs better overall in comparison to the repeater pistol. I know we just kind of bounced between repeater pistol and service pistol really quick, but you get it. As I mentioned, this is like the gold standard for handguns. It's flexible, the damage is fairly solid, it pulls its weight on clearing trash packs effectively, and it's just kind of fast and snappy. Pretty much every handgun has to compete with a service pistol spot. And overall, everyone seems to agree that it's an easy A tier weapon, because you really can't go wrong here either, and this is something that, again, every single handgun has to be compared to. So if it's better than the service pistol, I mean, what is really, it's S tier, and if it's not, it's gotta be lower. Following up is the Silverback Model 500, a classic 6-shooter that carries 5 rounds. Jokes aside, the Silverback is every bit as meaty and powerful as the revolver was in Remnant 1. What this brings to the table compared to other semi-automatic handguns is pure power. While it sits on only 5 rounds per cylinder, a skillful player who can place those weak spot hits consistently will often drop enemies in just 1 or 2 hits, even on Apocalypse, making trash duty very effective and methodical. While the revolver is powerful on its own right, it does have a few downsides that you have to trade for that damage. Mostly it comes in the reload speed, which is noticeably slower than other handguns. But it's not all bad, as you can stop the reload early if you need to shoot something really quick for like 1 or 2 shots, making it at least a bit more adaptable than a clip-based weapon that has to drop the whole thing every time. Definitely an A-tier weapon. Up next, Saro, and boy is that an apt name. Honestly though, there's nothing wrong with Saro, its damage is actually very solid for a handgun, but the low clip size and poor reload speeds make it cumbersome to use, like you're reloading a lot. And on top of the fact that it's a projectile weapon and not a hit scan, so it makes it kind of significantly harder to land weak spot hits consistently, like it just kind of feels weird. And that being said, it is very strong, and it is propped up by its mod, which lets you recall its bolts to refill your chamber without having to reload. And like the mod itself does like pretty poor damage, but it can't be enough to just drop like a bunch of bolts into Elite and then use the mod to recall them all, which does damage for them again, and finish it off. And like I said, the mod does refill your clip, so you can, get 10 rounds into the chamber if you have a bunch of bolts out there, and then, you don't have to reload. So if you can cycle between the mod and the actual shooting, it does feel a bit nicer. The mod can also be clunky though, because it's a projectile weapon, so often that last shot, if you have a clip size of 10, will give you just enough mod power to, use the mod again and reload. But because it takes time for that bolt to travel to an enemy, you often can go right into the reloading animation before that mod generation kicks in, and it kind of ruins the whole flow of the gun. But then also, I'm just not a fan of weapons like this where the gun and the mod scale entirely differently, making it awkward to have a forced damage mod on a gun. So overall, not a huge fan. I'm putting it in what I think is a well-deserved C tier list. Like, it's not terrible, but I feel like it could just have a few minor tweaks to feel a lot better. Okay, Starshot. This one's going to be controversial, I'm sure. So Starshot is a very unique handgun. It shoots both a normal shot as well as an explosive payload with no damage fall off. It has a relatively slow rate of fire compared to other handguns, and the damage is quite poor on Apocalypse in my opinion, because it's split damage. And because it's split damage, it's kind of difficult to scale the primary shot. Of course, what everyone knows and loves about Starshot is the mod Big Bang, which is just that. You fire the cosmos and pretty much kill everything in its sight, including yourself a lot of the time. The Big Bang mod might be the strongest single-use mod in the game, but there's a lot of downsides to the mod. First is that it is split to 3 damage types, mod power and explosive power separately on the shot, but also a fire burn as well. So it's actually very difficult to scale the mod effectively because you can only scale pieces at a time, which is kind of annoying. The mod also takes an absurd amount of mod power to maximize. I think it's about 3,000, and it's abysmally useless when not on full charge. And Big Bang also has such a huge radius that in most boss arenas, you're going to risk killing yourself with it if you don't have kinship. That's another forced tax on this weapon. So it's just another one of those mods with a lot of strings attached, which is, of course, not great. Now overall, the mod is fun, it's unique, and it's stylish, and the same goes for the weapon, and that counts, of course. But without the mod being maximized, the gun is pretty much of a burden. Burden of the Starshot, am I right? And of course, it's another weapon where you have a fixed damage mod, so you really can't scale both the mod and the actual gun very well. And honestly, it's good, but it's only really strong right now because a lot of people are abusing mod generation things. And mod generation in general is just out of whack. So people are getting it a lot more frequently than you should be. So once those get fixed, I think people will see that, it's not in a great spot. So I'm putting this in B tier, and I think that's generous, to be honest. It's cool, but it has way too many problems to deal with. And honestly, it's only really great on mod spam builds, which, like I said, are kind of broken right now. So we might have to revisit this one later. Okay, getting away from that mess, let's talk about Sure Shot, the old hunter's pistol. Pocket sniper. While used a little less than other handgun options in Remnant 2, the Sure Shot still packs a huge punch, and it is one of the strongest handguns in the game. It scales very well with the hug setup, and obviously it has great synergy with the sniper rifle, especially when you're doing Sidewinder and stuff. And there are plenty of different ways you can do hot swap builds with both the sniper and the Sure Shot. and these builds will allow you to pump out some very potent damage in a very short burst. And while Starshot basically demands no error in aiming, if you can master that, it's easily capable of one-tapping most enemies and taking down elites in just, 2 or 3 shots. It's effectively a backup sniper if you run out of sniper ammo, so like, what's not to love, really? Now, Starshot belongs in A tier. I would give it an S tier, but honestly, it just can't clear trash all that fast. But, I mean, it's a high A tier. Starshot is great. Almost done here. Next on the list, we have the Tech 22. Often compared with the SMG, the Tech 22 fires much faster, albeit with slightly weaker bullets and a smaller clip size, but it does allow you to mag dump into enemies far more often than the SMG, which help it take advantage of reload speed perks and items better than like an SMG could. Plus, the Tech 22 also has a silencer on it, which does reduce your sound radius, so you can't sneak up on enemies and get closer than like the SMG could. The Tech 22 otherwise fulfills the same roles as the SMG, just in a slightly different package, and honestly, they're pretty interchangeable in most cases. And there's not much more to say about this little guy, like it's about as good as the SMG, and so I kind of have to put it in A tier with all these other great handgun options. There's nothing really wrong with it. Alright, the last one, the Western Classic. This is my favorite handgun, easily. It's stylish, it sounds good, and it can just mag dump into bodies with very fast fire rate and a very quick reload. It just kind of feels great. And I think that's where it really shines, is just that ease of use. Unlike the other handguns where you kind of want to focus on a weak spot and headshot hits, the Western Classic really kind of performs its best when you just quickly mag dump without spending too much time aiming. Like, it has plenty of ammo reserves to take advantage of this, and that alone lets it have its own niche in the handgun market. I kind of wish I could trade some of the weak spot damage for a higher base damage, but that's just me. Of course, if you're mag dumping into bodies, your overall DPS is not going to be like amazing compared to doing your weak spot hits. And look, I'm not saying that you should only dump shots into the body, that's dumb, but what I'm saying is that you just point around the weak spot, and rather than try to slowly tap each one precisely, just click a bunch and dump it in that area. You're going to get a few weak spot hits, and that's going to be enough to put an enemy down regardless. Trust me, it's a great handgun, and it's really good if you just kind of like let go and just kind of spray. And while I would love to put it in an S tier, kind of through the votes, people seem to agree that it is an A tier weapon, and that's fine too. So that is all the handguns, and here are the placements given to them by myself and a handful of community members. Now, of course, this is only relevant in the current patch because who knows what will change in the future, and some things are a bit more subjective than others, I get that, so don't take this as like a definitive best to worst gun rankings because it's not, and pretty much every gun will perform admirably on Nightmare and lower difficulties, as I said countless of times in previous videos. Nothing is so bad that it can't be used, and it's only really when you start getting into Apocalypse and you start seeing the difference between like, monsters that have, 4 times as much HP that, the guns become a little bit more noticeable in their damage differences. But anyway, that's all for me. Thank you all for watching, and thank you to my Patreon members. I appreciate y'all. So stay tuned for the long gun tier list, but thanks again, and good luck out there, hunters.